So the reason why we sort of laid out our purpose as we did, which is to enable a zero carbon, lower cost energy future, is the enabling piece of that is key, which is basically we said we're not going to be the 80% of the power system that's probably going to be wind and solar out in 2050. We're going to be the other 20%, which is going to be supporting the system when there is no wind and there's no sun.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm John Feddersen, co-founder and chief executive of Aurora. And my guest on the show today has played and is playing one of the key roles in the decarbonisation of the British electricity system. He's the CEO of the UK's largest renewables generator. I think he's unusual as a CEO in that he's focusing on the very long term and orienting his business's strategy around that. He's focusing on how the power system is going to function as we approach net zero emissions in the 2030s and the 2040s, thinking about the roles of negative emissions technologies, thinking about the roles of flexibility and system services, and not just thinking about where the next few gigawatts of wind and solar will come over the next few years. He's also a commissioner of the Energy Transition Commission, which is a global coalition of leaders across the energy transition, and I think do a lot of very creative thinking on decarbonisation globally. And he's a member of the board of the Sustainable Biomass Program. My guest on the show today is Will Gardiner, CEO of Drax PLC. Welcome, Will.
Thank you, John. I'm very happy to be here.
There's plenty to talk about in terms of what Drax is doing, what our industry is doing, the energy transition in general. But I'd like to start by talking about you. And one thing that's striking about your history is you studied Russian studies at university, and then immediately, this was in the late 80s, and then you immediately went into Latin American banking. Can you explain how that? I mean, there's another question of how you ended up in the UK running a major power generator, which we may get to. But how did you make the transition from Russian to Latin America?
No, that's a great question, John. I mean, as everyone probably can tell, I grew up in the U.S. I'm originally from New York. Went to university at Harvard, and when I was in my first year there, I was sort of casting around for what I was interested in doing, what I wanted to major in. And Russian studies was something that was attractive to me for a couple of reasons. One was it was a multidisciplinary major, so language, history, literature, economics, and I was interested in all of those things. And so I took it up, went for it. And really, what I really enjoyed about that, or the thing that sort of captured my imagination, was a period in Russian, or I guess what was fair to call Soviet history in the 1920s, sort of before sort of Stalin took over and things took a major turn for the worse, where the Soviet Union was experimenting with different economic models as to what they might do to actually industrialize their economy. So, I finished that, or as I was finishing that, I was sort of looking for a job and, thought I might go into government and wasn't too interested or excited by that, and ended up talking to Citibank, and they had a program in Latin America, which actually was obviously super interesting. And the thing that captured my attention was, well, this is a developing world. So all the ideas that I had then, or had been studying about how you industrialize an economy, were very relevant to what was happening in Latin America at the time. And so had the opportunity to go be an expat. I wanted to sort of continue my interest in languages, head overseas, and I said, that sounds like a great opportunity. So I went for it.
Interesting. And it's the decision that I find striking there is you wanted to play a role in development. You'd studied Soviet history and a period in which things could have evolved very differently. Why did you choose and you said you'd turned off government. Why did you choose the private sector as the vehicle for having the impact rather than the public sector, I suppose, which people tend to affiliate more with, development and policy, obviously, and those types of things?
Again, very good question. I'd like to say that it was some sort of deep, sort of philosophical or sort of structural idea, but in actual fact, I went down to Washington, D.C. I met a couple of congressional offices, went to a couple of think tanks, and frankly, I didn't hear back from them for a while, and they didn't seem to be moving too fast. It all seemed a little bit slow paced. I went and had an interview at Citibank, and a couple of days later, they said, "Would you like the job?" Right? And so, to me, I was like, "Okay, these guys are moving; they're doing stuff."
Yeah.
And I would say, "Hey, that sounds like more the kind of pace I want to go for than being government." So,
Interesting.
and it ended up that's in my I ended up going, looking back at government. After I went to graduate school, I thought about it again, but again, I sort of was attracted to sort of being in the private sector and actually moving quickly and able to make a difference in that way. And that's the whole idea that actually companies can do lots of positive things, for example, now in the energy transition, as well as governments, I think is also now sort of built into my DNA. And so that's a big part of what we're doing at Drax as well.
Do you think that idea has moved on? It's, you think about, you're from New York, the US in the late 80s, early 90s, kind of, Wall Street mentality to where we are now. Do you think the role of the corporate fiduciary duty, all those sorts of things, do you think the perceived role of the corporation in society has moved on in the last 20, 30 years, or do you think it was always there? It's just we're calling it by different names.
The question as to what sort of the role of business in society is, I think, has maybe come around full circle, and that the last, who knows, maybe 40 years, the whole idea of profit maximizing as being the mantra for business has been primary, really often to the exclusion of other stakeholders. And I think, if you go back further than that, there was probably maybe a little bit more of a balanced view, and I think we're coming more to a balanced view now. I mean, so one of the things that, as you know, the corporate governance code in the UK now requires businesses to assess the impact of their actions on all stakeholders. For us at Drax, purpose is a critical element of what we're doing. I mean, our purpose is to enable a zero carbon, lower cost energy future. And I think that, for lots of good business reasons, but also beyond that, considering the impact of what we do on all stakeholders makes a lot of sense. I'm not discarding the idea, and obviously our shareholders are very important, and we want to make sure that we do what's best for them too. But it is a more rounded picture in my view.
So can we talk about your role and about Drax? So just on that mission point, why do people join Drax, do you think? Is it, you talked about playing a role in net zero. How important is that to the latest cohort of engineers or technical people that join the company nowadays?
I think it's absolutely key, John. I mean, when I joined Drax 5 years ago, the company had a couple of very important things going for it and a lot of challenges, right? So it had this incredible history of having made this transformation to biomass in a very, really radical way. And we should come back to that. I can get into that in more detail. But so that was a real strength. And on the other side, the question was, what was Drax's future going to be? And so if you think about it in that context, why would anybody want to come work there? And so I think what I wanted to do is make sure that the idea that, the skills and the capabilities that Drax had, so the asset base, generating power using biomass, I think very valuable and very important to the UK power system. But more importantly, the engineering skills and the mentality where the company said, well, I'm going to do something that hasn't been done before. And if you link that to the purpose, which is about, we've gone from having more than 20 million tons of CO2 emissions to about 2. And we will be lower next year. We're going to be coming off coal at the end of March. If you sort of focus on that mission and purpose, you can get, I think, really we can attract people who otherwise wouldn't come, right? And some of the problems we're trying to solve by doing that. So, for example, the whole question of biomass sustainability, we're world leaders in the field. We passionately believe that the biomass we use has to be sustainable. And, given that challenge, we can get some great people who are really interested in that topic. So the purpose and the vision is absolutely key.
Yeah, it's interesting that I talked about the purpose or the mission or whatever you call it, but also the idea that you're trailblazing, right? I don't know if BECCS, negative emissions technology has been done at scale anywhere in the world.
Sometimes it's a little bit scary, but that's also exciting, right? And it will work. I'm confident that that's the case. But it's going to be a big challenge along the way, and a lot of it is going to have to be done by us, right?
Yeah.
And I think it also, to be fair, it's exciting to some people, but it's not exciting for everybody. I mean, we're not a typical place that isn't moving very fast, where there's a lot of continuity, there's a lot of change, and people that come to Drax have to be ready for that.
I think it's a fool's errand as an organization to try to be everything to everyone. In a sense, it's probably a separate conversation, but certainly what I find at Aurora in general. What's the most important? I was speaking to, and as I thought about what to talk to you about today, I sort of reflected on a recent podcast with Laurie Fitch, who's a director of EDP, among others, and an advisor. And I asked her, what's the most important trait of a publicly listed CEO? What do you think is most important for a publicly listed CEO in terms of traits?
It's really in some ways a sort of paradoxical, or maybe it will sound that way. One is, I think, a very sort of profound sort of belief, confidence, and self-belief in what you're trying to achieve, right? So that whole idea that the purpose of what we're trying to do, that I have a lot of confidence and passion and commitment to delivering that, sort of at one end of the spectrum. But at the same time, I think sort of having the humility and the self-awareness also to realize that you don't have all the answers, that you're going to need help along the way, that you need to actually have, for example, the way I like to work with my team is I'm encouraged them to push me as opposed to the other way around, and to help me achieve the things that I want to achieve. So it's a sort of an interesting combination of, I need to sort of recognize, be humble, and sort of be real in a sense, and recognize that there are lots of things that I don't know and I will need help with. All at the same time, having that sort of passionate sort of mission and vision and desire to achieve what I think we need to achieve.
To some extent, they are contradictory impulses, right? Is you're the guy leading the charge, you're the guy drumming up the enthusiasm and telling people why what you're doing is important, and at the same time questioning yourself, on all of those things.
Exactly, and that's usually sort of at that 4 a.m. wake up call, and you sort of say, well, which one is it right now? Is it the passionate belief, or is it the questioning?
Yeah.
But no, you have to have both, right? Because and the other part of it is you are out there in front, you are out there on your own, and you need to also have, frankly, also have people around you who will tell you how they see it, right?
Cool.
The last thing you want to do is be running off in one direction and everybody turn around and there's nobody there. Right? So actually having a team that really sort of keeps your feet on the ground is also super important.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, Laurie's response was, you got people who can skate to where the puck is and see the future, and I just felt like that was almost too. And I did challenge her on that. It sort of seems almost like too high a bar to say the best CEOs can see the future. In a sense, but I can see why that's important in the power sector, and certainly, the visionaries.
What you say, John. I mean, if you take a company like Ørsted, and you sort of ask the question, did they, as Laurie would have suggested, see the future and skate to the puck, or did they create that future? Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure. I don't have the answer to that question.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting question to think about, because I'm not sure that, would offshore wind be where it is now without a lot of the things that they had done?
It's a really good point. Yeah. And what looks like chance and luck or vision may well have just been a lot of hard work to shape the world around your strategy. That's a really good point.
That's actually one of the things I believe, is that the getting to where you get to is never sort of predetermined, and it is the outcome of a lot of small decisions and a lot of hard work along the way, and sort of choosing each right turn at the right time.
Yeah, that's a great segue. So Drax Power Station, right? It was, I think, probably the biggest coal power station in Western Europe, 4 gigawatts. Now, what strikes me about the story is that it's survived, right? It's a profitable asset, highly profitable asset in many ways, when most of the rest of the coal fleet no longer exists. And I suppose as an example of kind of shaping the future based on a strategy by yourself, by your predecessor in Dorothy Thompson, what were the big decisions that really enabled you to shape that future. And can you say a bit about the role of government and the role of your shareholders in enabling that to happen?
No, sure. I mean, I think the first one may be an obvious one. It was the decision to start exploring the whole idea of converting to biomass in the first place. If you actually go back and you talk to people on my team, people like Jason Shipston, who's my head of innovation, and you say, and you listen to some of the stories. I mean, we've tested, for example, hundreds of different fuel types, right? And we've done co-firing, we've done local sourcing, we've done international sourcing. So in some ways, one of the things that I think is fascinating is sort of the decision to start in the first place and then put an incredible amount of sort of detailed hard work and effort behind the whole process is probably the first that was the first step in the journey. Second one was clearly, as you say, very good and strong engagement with government. And I think at the time, the interesting thing is that there was, in some ways, a lot more enthusiasm for biomass then than there, maybe in a general sense there is now. And so there was a nice sort of strong tailwind in that sense. But if I the one decision that strikes me as being the critical one was at one point, the company was advancing along a path of doing sort of co-firing biomass across multiple units. That was the system that was sort of technically being designed and that the government was supporting. And at least I wasn't personally involved, but the way the story has been told to me, that sort of all of a sudden the government came out and said, well, actually, we're only going to support biomass if it's 100% and without co-firing, right? And all of a sudden the team was like, oh my gosh, how are we going to deal with that, right? And the key decision, or the key, I'm not sure you call it a decision, the key sort of engineering sort of feat, if you will, that was achieved was actually being able to switch from a co-firing of 10, 20% to 100% biomass generation and actually have it work well. And that is still, I think, something that not very many other power stations have achieved, right? So, and the question was, could you still generate 645 megawatts of power, from, which is what coal would generate? Could you do that with biomass? Which the answer is yes, right? Could you be 39% efficient as we were on coal? And the answer is yes. So could you have the same ramp rates? Yes. So fundamentally, the team, our team of engineers, did an amazing job. Was able to actually sort of pivot and get to a point where actually we're able to do pretty much, very much exactly what we were doing on coal now with biomass, and that to me was a real breakthrough. Yeah.
Do you get inbounds from people around the world saying, we want to follow this approach and do that elsewhere? Do you get the sense that sort of this was something that's encouraged others around the world to have a go?
That we do, and the interesting thing is that we sort of get to the point in the story that I've just reached with you, and we say, we went for 100%, and oftentimes, I'll be talking to the senior execs at those different power stations or power companies. I'll say, well, my engineers don't want to try that. Right? So, and one of the things that I've found is that, I don't want to generalize too much, but a good, well-run coal-fired power station is not necessarily a place you want to innovate, right? Yeah. The guys are very capable and very good at doing what they're doing. It's a fundamentally dangerous thing, and it's all about availability and at the end of the day, you want to keep running as you're running. And so there are sort of barriers in a sense to innovation in that sense. But maybe the sort of follow on from your point, there are definitely markets where there's more opportunity and starting to happen, and we are starting to look at those, right? So whether that's Japan, where there is already an attractive subsidy regime, so there's lots of co-firing that's already starting to happen. But the Japanese government, I think, announced over the summer the need to retire, I think it's 30 gigawatts of coal, and wow. So the opportunity to do more there. We're looking at getting involved there. There was we've been doing a bunch of work. I should actually say more accurately, some of our sort of pellet trade associations have been doing a bunch of work in Germany on trying to get a regulatory regime in there in Germany that is attractive for biomass, probably primarily for CHP and district heating, for example. And I think that has some interesting promise. And fundamentally, when BECCS becomes more widespread, I think there's a real opportunity to do more with that. So
Yeah, interesting. And you just from the Drax strategy perspective, your focus on those markets would be more about pellets, possibly the BECCS technology, rather than generating electricity itself.
But I think so. I mean, fundamentally, I think we think that if I sort of think about the different pieces of value that we think we are sort of really capable of bringing to the table. So one is the pellet supply chain, and that's really not only about sort of making and delivering the pellets. It's about doing that in a sustainable way. And again, I'm happy to talk more about that. But the whole question of sustainability is again central to what we do, and we need to be. I mean, I believe personally and very passionately that if what we do doesn't contribute to a healthy and growing forest and result in more CO2 being captured than otherwise would be the case, then I don't think it's something we should do, right? And so we have a very effective supply chain that does deliver that. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of one way to get involved. I mean, the technical capability we have, I think that's another way we can get involved, what I was describing before. But on the other side of that, for us to sort of venture out and start to be a majority owner of a power station in another country where we were going to be doing the trading, et cetera, that's probably beyond where we want to go.
In terms of like the sustainability, the provenance of biomass, is it easy to just know exactly where biomass has come from? Is there a global system that says this is not old growth forest, this is sustainably harvested, or is it a bit less transparent than that?
There are certification schemes. You mentioned at the top of the podcast that I'm a board member of the Sustainable Biomass Program, and that is a certification scheme that effectively certifies that the biomass is sustainable. And some of the attributes that biomass would have would be, one is that you can absolutely verify exactly where it's come from. So it doesn't come from old growth forests. It doesn't come from places where there's been damage to biodiversity. It comes from forests that are growing and healthy. You can actually, there's data attached to that can describe its carbon footprint, et cetera. So the key thing about the Sustainable Biomass Program, which is the certification scheme that is accepted in pretty much all of the countries that are doing biomass at scale. Mm-hmm. But actually the answer to your question is yes. If you have that certification, then you can actually be confident where it's coming from.
Okay, you pass a bunch of tests. You're a pellet producer. You pass a bunch of tests, and then you can claim it, and it's trusted and relied upon.
Exactly, again, make no mistake. There are ways of using biomass that don't make sense, right? Or what we like to call there's good biomass, which is I think what we're using and what the Sustainable Biomass Program would certify. And then there's bad biomass, which doesn't have those qualities where it can be a problem. So it's very important that we do it in the right way.
It'd be good to come back on that. But just before I do, can you say a bit about how the ESG investor movement, so environmental, social, governance movement is impacting your life at Drax from the perspective of investor management, how people see the company, those types of things?
This has been something of a journey for Drax in the sense that I remember must have been one of the first weeks that I joined at the end of 2015. Norges Bank announced that they were effectively blacklisting Drax because we were using coal. And that to me was, again, in my view, one of the very sort of good examples of how negative the ESG sort of approach could be, right? So here you have a company that's done a massive amount to decarbonize, and because they're still using some coal, they get blacklisted by the world's largest investor. So that was not a helpful thing, right? Now the positive side of that story is last year, Norges Bank sort of unblacklisted us, whatever the term is, and now is an investor and actually sort of has recognized the fact that we've made huge progress to come off coal, right? And I think that's where the whole ESG movement is going. That the recognition that there are companies trying to do the right thing, and you need to understand in detail what they're about. I think their investors and funds that are focused in that way are they're adding sort of more sophisticated analysis to their toolkits, is in addition to looking at the Carbon Disclosure Project, or I can't remember all of the different TCFD, or all the different acronyms, all the different Sustainalytics, all the different programs. Because one of the challenges with all those different sort of scoring systems is that different systems can give very different outcomes to the same company because they have different ways of approaching the problem, right? So I think the key thing for Drax is that we are getting lots of interest from people who recognize the decarbonization story that we've had to date with biomass. they're also starting to recognize or get very interested in the possibilities around negative emissions. And we're going to be, we're going to be making more steps in that direction. I think gas is increasingly challenged. Again, you would have seen in the Climate Change Committee's report from a couple of days ago on the sixth carbon budget. The comment there is, I think they're saying that no more unabated gas should be built post 2030. So there's more ways we will keep moving in that direction.
Just on that sort of system, you talked about different metrics for establishing ESG credentials. Do you think we will converge on one system, or do you think it will just naturally be a bit of a murky qualitative space where people can choose the metrics they want to focus on?
No, it's a very good question, John. And I think if you take the E, the S, and the G, I think if you try to cover all three of those, there's going to have to be some qualitative elements to that. I think, though, that there will be increasingly in some areas. So, for example, in the whole area of carbon, the world is going to start becoming much more metrics driven, right? And it actually, as we get more. And I guess, again, this sort of comes back to my thoughts around negative emissions. I mean, if negative emissions, so by which I mean the removal of, let's say, a ton of CO2 from the atmosphere, if that becomes a tradable commodity, and I think it will be, then you have something that actually people stand up and say, okay, we've got something that has real value. And so there will be metrics around those types of things, right? So pieces of the ESG agenda. So what is your carbon footprint? Which we will be able to increasingly measure in sophisticated ways that people will be putting value on. I think those will become real hard metrics, right? Some of the other things, which is, what's my community impact? I think people will recognize the importance of those, but it'll be more judgmental.
Yeah. We've talked about the sort of the Drax story, and I think that's a really interesting example with Norges Bank, a sort of former coal generator turned massive renewables generator. And it can be a bit of a tricky story to explain. And it's not wind and solar. It's biomass, and so when you start talking about biomass and cutting trees down, irrespective whether it's sustainable or not, it's a slightly more difficult story than someone who's just a pure play wind generator, for example. You've talked about public markets. What about the public? What's your sense in terms of when Drax is out there in public and you tell your story, which to someone who knows the industry is phenomenally positive on the environmental side of it, how do the public think about Drax as an organization?
It's a great question, and something we, as you might imagine, we think about, or I think about a lot. Just give you a sort of a story. When I first became the CEO about 3 years ago, one of the questions that I asked the team to address very explicitly was, is Drax a good name for the company? Right? Because on the one hand, you Google Drax and you get all sorts of strange answers to that question. If you think about what some of the environmental NGOs think about Drax, not a very good story for some of them. Think about the coal history, again, not a great story, but we did quite a lot of research on that, and we actually discovered, well, at that point, so again, about 3 years ago, for people who are involved in the power industry, for people involved in engineering, there was a real appreciation for some of the things that Drax had done. So we sort of said, okay, we're going to start there and we're going to build on that. Right? And so I think that we're making real progress in helping people understand what we're doing. And the biomass part of it is probably more challenging because it's not a simple story to tell. So we need to get people to the point where we sort of say, well, what we're doing is actually helping make forests more healthy, as opposed to the visions people might have of, well, you're just chopping down trees, which, by the way, we don't do. We only use trees that are residuals or have no better use, if you will. So the key thing, again, we are telling that story, and I think we are convincing people that makes sense. But the interesting thing for me, what I think is exciting, and maybe I'll go back to the first part of your question, which is, if you're not just wind, what are you, right? So the reason why we sort of laid out our purpose as we did, which was to enable a zero carbon, lower cost energy future, is the enabling piece of that is key, which is basically, we said, we're not going to be the 80% of the power system that's probably going to be wind and solar out in 2050. We're going to be the other 20%, which is going to be supporting the system when there is no wind and there's no sun. And again, that's the story that's the place where we are now, and that's going to be central to our story going forward. But again, also to your point, not that easy to explain. But I think again, for people in the power sector, I think people get that, right?
Yeah, and at least in my eyes, it's the tricky bit, right? The sort of getting wind and I mean, obviously we've done spectacular things in reducing costs in renewables, but the head scratching bit for me, and I think it's reflected in the Committee on Climate Change's work, is and they've been scratching their heads pretty hard on it, is how are we keeping the lights on in the middle of winter? And
you've seen the system in the last couple of weeks, right?
Yeah,
it has been very short, and they've been last 1 or 2 units on the system, and it's been challenging.
And fossil fuels playing a massive role.
Absolutely, some of the coal and some of the sort of the less efficient CCGTs, etc.
Yeah. So it is. I mean, it's a small digression. It's there's that old saying, when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, and I suppose solar and wind people tend to get upset that's getting wheeled out again, but it's, as far as I'm concerned, it is fundamental, which is keeping the lights on in January, in the evening when it's sub-zero, is a fossil. At the moment, our only answer to that on the grid is fossil fuels.
Well, with the exception of the Drax biomass power generation.
We of course, there's bits and pieces and the nuclear plants.
And also in the Cruachan pump storage, John, you got to remember that too.
Yeah, very good. We may not get a chance to talk about Cruachan pump storage because there's a few other things I want to talk about that Drax is doing. Could I just, one more thing on the slightly more complicated story topic? So one thing that strikes me about Drax. So David Nussbaum joined as a director. I don't know, several years ago. I recall he'd been the CEO of WWF, the World Wildlife Fund in the UK. How can you tell me how that came up? Because this is Drax of 4 years ago, I suppose, where coal was still there, and you hadn't bought Cruachan, you weren't doing that either. How did that come about, and what sort of role does David play as a director at Drax?
So what happened there, John, is that as this is, and Dorothy was the CEO, and I was very much involved in this process when I was the CFO. We were looking at the board and saying, what is it that we think is critical that we have to make sure that we have the credibility and the knowledge around the table of the challenges that we face, and recognizing that the whole world of the NGOs was one which we needed to engage with in a better way. We basically said, look, we need to find someone who has a deep background in sustainability, understands the nuances of the issues, and really can help us engage in that space. And so that's really, I mean, in a nutshell, what sort of led us to David. And he does absolutely brings that to the table. And an interesting, I mean, he's got a very interesting background. I mean, he has been involved. He was involved in business, I think, I think private equity or before that. So he's got a very sharp business mind. But he's very passionate about wanting to make sure that we do, follow Section 172 and consider all of our stakeholders, and that we consider a lot of these issues in the round, which is very helpful for us, right? And then keeping us honest, right? I mean, I think one of the things it's an interesting question. For example, the Sustainable Biomass Program is in the middle of doing a review of our standard, right? And just as an example, that is a multi-stakeholder organization. We have a multi-stakeholder board, and again, it's a very interesting topic, which we can probably also don't have time to get into. But actually making sure that standard, for example, is something that is well accepted and has credibility across civil society. Again, super important, right? Yeah. Because otherwise, you have it and people just they don't buy into it, and you have a real problem. So David's sort of, again, his advice, guidance, and help that for me, for example, is very useful in that space.
Yeah, I mean that's the whole. In a sense, that's the whole point of the certification. I suspect. Exactly. Can we? So I want to talk about biomass, and then I want to talk about BECCS, which is obviously biomass is about using biofuel wood, often wood pellets, to generate power, and BECCS is about storing that underground so that it's a net negative emissions technology. Just starting with the biomass bit. One thing that, and again, I shouldn't admit to this, but I do kind of get confused about life cycle emissions in biomass, and it seems like it seems odd to me. And I had Chris Hunt on the podcast earlier in the year, and you know he invests in Viva, which is a biomass company as well, and I sort of said, why this seems like an empirical question, right? How much carbon is there in biomass? And yet it still seems like it's a question that's open to debate. Where are the uncertainties in sort of measuring these things?
I think it's less an uncertainty about measuring things, but it's more about, so one, sort of understanding the facts on the ground, and I think there's a basic point there. So for example, you know, the fact that the wood that we use is is effectively a byproduct of other things that are happening in the forest. I mean, as I said before, the wood we use is either it's a residual from a sawmill, it might be limbs and tops that are part of a harvest where the objective of that harvest is to get saw logs, which is where the value in most forests come from. So there's an understanding question. The other question, of course, is what is the counterfactual, right? So what else would that biomass have been used for? So if that biomass, for example, if it had been, I'll give you an example. In Canada, some of the wood that our suppliers use would otherwise have been stacked by the side of the road and burned on the spot, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're using that wood to generate power and then by definition displacing a fossil fuel, right, then it's hard to argue that that's not a better use for that biomass, right?
Yeah.
But if you argue that biomass, otherwise would have been used for fuel, anyway. So it's much more about the counterfactual, I think, is the key issue, right? And so for me, and maybe the final point I was going to make is also to understand what is the impact of what we are doing on the forest, right? So let me give you another example. So if you have a forest that is sort of mature and stops growing, it doesn't capture any more CO2, right? If you selectively harvest parts of that forest every year, so it continues to grow, it will capture more CO2 every year, and it will have and because the trees that are planted in a plantation managed forest tend to be bigger than the ones that they're replacing because of advances in the forestry management, then you're actually contributing to a growing carbon stock, right? And because you're part of that ecosystem, it actually helps to increase the carbon stock, not the reverse, at a forest level, right?
Yeah. And again, this is my novice knowledge of biomass, but just thinking in terms of the general equilibrium effects, I suppose the other counterfactual is, would the tree even exist but for the commercial purpose for the end purpose? But cows are a phenomenally successful species because they provide something that humans want. You'd have a lot less cows if there wasn't a meat market to an extent. Might be a reasonable analogy. It might offend a lot of people in some ways as well.
The way I think about that is that people who are illegally deforesting in the Amazon are not doing that because they want to make wood pellets, right? I mean, they're doing that because they want to create grazing land for the cows you just mentioned, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, for me, if you provide that incremental economics to the forest owner that actually encourage him to plant trees again, that's a good outcome.
Or more trees. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Excellent. Can you just briefly talk about, they often talk about the economics of biomass supply from Europe and the US. Is there a simple way to think about, because people say, it's going across the Atlantic, that must be, highly carbon intensive. I mean, should we be trying to establish our own European biomass supply chain on the scale of what we're seeing in the southeast of the US?
So if you think about the economics of biomass, or there's sort of three broad categories. There's the cost of the actual fiber itself, right? And the lowest cost fiber comes from the areas where the trees grow the fastest, right? So the best places to get your fiber the best place is probably the southern parts of South America, Uruguay, southern Brazil, far from the Amazon, just to be clear. And because eucalyptus there can go to maturity in 7 years, so the return to the owner of that forest can be quite high on a repeatable basis. That's one part of it. The other big part of the cost is the logistics, right? So the closer you are to the source of the biomass, the better you are, and that also has a better carbon outcome. So we are very much supportive and trying to now, trying to do as much as we can to use domestic material, but the domestic UK forestry industry is very small, which is why we import most of our wood pellets. Yeah. So, but to the extent that we can get more from Europe, that's also attractive, and we try to have a diversified base. But what's tended to happen so far, and maybe there's another important factor here, which also is the sustainability criteria. I mean, the U.S. forests in the Southeast have very well established rules and reporting around how they manage their forests, which is critical for us, as I mentioned before. So what's tended to happen so far is that the costs of the fiber have outweighed the cost of the logistics, and that's really why we get a lot of our pellets from the southeast of the U.S.
Yeah, interesting. And interesting on that first point. It's sort of if it takes a lot more land than to grow it in Europe than it does in Argentina, then that's the same volume of pellets. Then that complicates things as well, I suspect.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about biomass. BECCS. So BECCS is about, you as I understand it, you grow the tree, it absorbs the carbon. You use the parts of the tree that don't have other purposes to produce the pellets. You burn them, which obviously releases the carbon dioxide, and close to zero on a life cycle basis. And then with BECCS, you put that carbon underground. You sequester it so that it's underground. It's not in the atmosphere causing the Earth to warm. Can we get to net zero without negative emissions technologies, Will?
No, I don't believe we can. Right, and so if you look again at the Climate Change Committee's report just around the UK, I mean they require BECCS specifically in all of the scenarios that they released, I think on Tuesday, and we're talking about anywhere between roughly 50 and 100 million tons of BECCS a year, right? And that's in 2050. I mean, in their report, they actually say we would need about 23 million tons of BECCS in 2035, right? And I think so. And the interesting thing about it is it's not sort of just that you will need it. It's also that it can be a lower cost and a more feasible way of doing things, right? So everyone talks, for example, about the importance ultimately of some form of sustainable aviation fuel, right? Well, we think that's very important and will be important that we have it, but it's not here yet, right? Whereas I can do BECCS, if you give me if I press the button today because I've got the right setup, the right support mechanism, I could be up and running in 2027, right? So the idea that BECCS is here and now, it can capture CO2 at scale. It's important for the whole system to get to net zero. It's absolutely right. I'll give you another thought on a global scale. We did a lot of work last year with McKinsey to say, how much biomass could be done on a sustainable basis, or how much BECCS could be done with sustainable biomass on an annual basis globally. And then sort of the number we came up with, which is actually quite conservative, and it's conservative because we used quite stringent sustainability criteria. It's about 4 gigatons. And that's roughly equivalent to the amount of emissions that aviation has today. So again, play a key. And the final point I would make on this is that in addition to just being necessary, it can be a lower cost way of getting there. Right? So if it costs me, let's say, 100 pounds a ton, it's going to cost a lot more than that to get to the sustainable aviation fuels, for example. Right?
Yeah.
So why wouldn't we, on a cross-economy basis, choose the lower costs ways of decarbonizing as opposed to the more expensive ones?
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. And it strikes me as probably self-evident, right? There are just some uses of fossil fuels that are so much better than anything else we have. Aviation being an obvious one, but there are others. I mean, the power system, I suppose, covering the winter peak is potentially another one. Hydrocarbons are just wonderful cheap stores of energy. That if we can do negative emissions at the levels that you suggest, it seems like it's obviously the cheaper solution. Why? So government might say, others might say, well, why do we need to support it now, right? So we can, without going into the detail on the Committee on Climate Change's scenarios, say to 2030, we can do a lot of that just by building solar panels and wind farms, right? And that's not 100 pounds a ton. That's much cheaper than that in terms of doing it. Is the natural response well, let's just wait a bit and let's give it 5 years, see how the the sustainable aviation fuels progress, and then we can start doing it then?
I'll give it that sort of the general answer, and then I'll give you a very Drax specific one, very clear. So first one is that if you're going to get the, we're working hard now at full speed to get BECCS up and running as fast as we can. And the fastest we would be ready to go is 2027. Right? Yeah. So if we wait 5 more years, it'll be 2032, et cetera, et cetera. And again, go back to some of those numbers from the Climate Change Committee, 23 million tons by 2035. Right? Mm-hmm. We could do 16 million tons of BECCS at Drax. Right? So this is the sort of the second argument. There is no one else in the country that can do a fraction of that. Right? Yeah. If you tried to do as much carbon capture or enough negative emissions as that by planting trees, you'd have to plant as many trees as would cover all of Wales, right? So the opportunity to do direct air capture, I don't know how much space it would take, but it's a hugely more expensive and very difficult to scale. So to actually do this, I think we have to sort of quote unquote start now, but actually we won't be capturing our first ton of CO2 probably until the late 20s, right? So the second point is, and if I go back to this idea that we're looking not only at doing BECCS at Drax, but we're looking at opportunities to do it in other parts of the UK. We're also looking at other parts of the US, right? So if you go back to, for example, the US and say, well, if a lot of the cost of this is logistics, I didn't mention this, but another piece of the cost is the pelletizing. If I actually had a power station right by a sawmill, and I basically just took the sawmill sawdust and put it right into the boiler, and I basically then tapped into an existing CO2 pipeline, of which there are many already in Louisiana, it would be a very low cost way to do this, right? So anyway, the point I was going to make is that the thing about Drax is that it's a ready-made opportunity to do this at scale. And if we are, by 2027, we would stop running without further government support. So we're planning for that. And if we can convert it to do BECCS at that point in time, it makes a ton of sense. We can make a huge difference to the UK's climate change ambitions. But if we don't do that, then we'll probably shut it down, and you're going to have to find the 16 million tons somewhere else, right?
If you do shut it down, a lot of the coal stations are shutting down now or over the next few years. If you do shut it down, does it become harder then because BECCS seems to be naturally something you would do in a coal power station that's no longer burning coal. Does it become harder to revive this, or is there a version of BECCS which doesn't involve former coal power stations?
The answer to your question is yes and yes. So it does become harder. I mean, once those coal-fired power stations or the Drax power station running biomass, once they stop rotating and they stop doing that for any length of time, I mean, you have both the cost of maintaining those things in working order, which gets into the tens of millions over time, if not hundreds. And then there's also the risk that comes with having infrastructure that deteriorates. You end up with unknowable risks around. Drax power station is 50 years old already, right? To have it sitting idle for a couple of years is not a risk. I think it's probably not a risk that we will want to take.
Yeah.
But the other answer to your question is absolutely. I mean, we are also exploring doing this. You build a new biomass power station and you add CCS to it. That's absolutely an interesting and exciting idea that we're looking at as well.
Interesting. I suppose it's a little bit like the argument around the nuclear supply chain, and there's a whole bunch of expertise, or there's a whole bunch of opportunity that potentially you let lapse if you don't move within a certain time frame. So we've got 7 years to work it out. It sounds like.
I'm going to correct that, John. Sorry, we don't
like
really
it to be early.
We don't really have 7 years to work it out because if I have confidence in the sort of plans that we have and in the government support mechanism by the end of next year, then I will press the button on my FEED study, and that'll let me be up and running by 2027, right? If I don't have that, then I'm going to start pushing it out, right? So I would say we have sort of a year or two to get ourselves comfortable that we want to spend the money this is going to take.
Do you think government are thinking about BECCS as a sort of, we hear government crow about the offshore wind industry in the UK, which has been a phenomenal success, driven costs down globally, leader for the rest of the world. Do you think government is thinking about BECCS in that sort of context? Look at the McKinsey study. We're talking gigatons of decarbonisation. of BECCS playing a big role globally. Do you think government is thinking about it in that sort of sense, that you could really start a global industry here?
That's absolutely the story we think we have to tell. I think that the UK is unusually well positioned to be the first in the world to do this. I mean, we have the biomass, the sustainability regime. We have the sort of biomass sort of power generating capability, and that's not just Drax. There's other people that are doing it. We have sort of the ability to be a global leader in CCS. We've got the offshore sort of skills from the offshore oil and gas industry. We've got the aquifers to store the CO2. So we have all of the pieces. And my sort of argument to government is if we start now and we give the supply chain, and that supply chain from the engineering and design through the building of the metal pipes, et cetera, through the actual building of the power stations, et cetera, we give ourselves the confidence to do this, we can absolutely be a global leader and export that capability. That's absolutely should be part of the game.
Interesting. And I suppose it feels, at least to me, like the time between now and COP26 is a kind of critical period for this, like a lot of other, I suppose, like a number of other key policy and energy areas for the UK government. Great. I wanted to ask you about the other big focus of Drax, which is on the system services and flexibility space, but time is beating us. So, and I don't want to miss the opportunity to ask you about a few concepts in the energy transition, to ask you if you think they're overrated or underrated. So don't feel the pressure to elaborate on your responses. Just keen to get a sense of your views on these concepts. So the first concept is power markets' role during the energy transition. Do you think power markets are overrated or underrated in terms of the role they need to play in the energy transition?
So I'm going to sort of hedge a little. I think underrated in the sense that I think that when I say power markets as they are implemented and impacted by the government, right? So, for example, power markets in the UK, influenced by the importance of a carbon tax, have played a huge role.
Yeah. Okay. The market alone will not get us where we need to get to.
Markets which always have sort of government influence, but the government's using wisely the markets to do what they want them to do. That's, I think, absolutely going to be an important part.
Okay. The second concept is international utilities. So utilities that generate power in multiple countries. Do you think they're overrated or underrated?
Again, I would say probably underrated in the sense that I think I have found there's a lot of skill transfer, knowledge transfer that happens within companies more easily than across them. I also think that the ESG sort of impact from companies headquartered in sort of Western Europe or the US, and I would say actually probably more primarily in Western Europe, can have a big impact in countries where otherwise that might not be the case.
Yeah. Okay. And then finally, we touched on this earlier in the conversation, the ESG investment movement in influencing capital deployment. Do you think its role is overrated or underrated in influencing capital deployment?
I think it's probably overrated. Maybe I qualify that as well. The ESG movement as a sort of specific movement, overrated. I think societal pressure for companies to do the right thing is absolutely having a big impact, but probably that's more general, I would say, than necessarily a specific movement.
Okay, interesting. It's slight. I think most responses to that tend to go in the opposite direction. Certainly, the zeitgeist at the moment is on the influence of the ESG movement. Well, thanks very much. I think that's a natural time to finish. Thanks for sharing your expertise with us. I think if we're going to hit net zero any time before 2050, many of the things we discussed today will likely play a very big role. So, Will Gardiner, thanks so much for taking the time to speak.
Can I just, John, I'm going to drop in one final thought, if I may.
Of course.
I don't know if you saw this, but so Occidental Petroleum, which is, in addition to being one of the world's biggest oil companies, has a very big carbon capture and storage sort of already a business. And they actually announced that their vision is that they're going to transform themselves into a carbon management company. Let's leave you with that thought, because that's really, they said it before I did, but that's really the vision that I have for Drax. That ultimately what our business is going to be about is negative emissions and actually sort of managing carbon.
That was John Feddersen, co-founder and chief executive of Aurora, speaking to Will Gardiner, CEO of Drax plc. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.